Thanks, Ben. Well, I'm looking forward to the whiskey tasting with Ivo, Kate, and Craig. I think that should be a great event following Beijing 2022. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. It's my great pleasure to chair this next panel. We have a very, very experienced set of panelists, so I'll just quickly run through and introduce them to you. Delighted to have another member of the International Olympic Committee with us, Dagmawit, Berhane. Andrew Ryan, Executive Director of ASOIF, who will be known to many of you. Paul Foster, CEO of Global Esports, and I think it's probably, I don't know, it's late at night or early in the morning for you, Paul. And John Dutton, CEO of Rugby League World Cup. So a very esteemed panel. I had the privilege of meeting them last week. So I'm looking forward to the next sort of 45 to 50 minutes with them. What I thought we'd do to start off is the topic of this session is the impact of and lessons from the pandemic. Is each of the panelists is going to give you a sort of a 5-minute perspective from their own particular personal and professional view as to exactly where they think we are at this point in time, starting with Dagmawit. Over to you, Dagmar.
Thank you very much, and it gives me a great honor to be part of this panelist team, and I'm very honored also to address all participants which are attending this conference entitled The Impact and the Lessons from the Pandemic. And I come from the background of the IOC membership, and I'd like to focus and give the general background of this topic I'd like to address in shedding light in the 3 main points, if I may. So I would like to say, a couple of months before, or even a year before, we were all in the mode of saying, the pandemic, the post-pandemic, and so on. But right now, where we are, from the IOC perspective, I think we believe we are now in a moment where we believe it is now a lived experience for us as an Olympic movement, and this is how I would like to approach it. And I'm saying now, the pandemic is a lived experience mainly because we now have a blueprint. And when I say a blueprint, this pandemic for us, we just had a couple of months before the Tokyo 2020 Olympic Games, and as you all know, these games help the IOC together with all its stakeholders to draw the right lessons for the future of the Olympic Games and the movement. So we've been very fortunate, and before the games happened, we were, until the last minute, I would say, we were not sure. There was no certainty of how and how the games would impact the world. And I'm proud to say, and being part of it and being in the games, I was very pleased to see that it actually reached out millions and millions of people, not only in the movement, but in terms of the global reach, in terms of having a different perspective in approaching the world of sports. So and that was tuned in a way that the game's delivery was possible in a safe and secured way. And I would like to point out here, when I say safe and secured, nothing is out of risk. And the WHO, executive director, in speaking and addressing the IOC session back in Tokyo, he said very clearly, for the pandemic, for us to witness that the games actually happening in Tokyo, he said that it shows and it clearly demonstrates that we cannot avoid risk 100%, but rather what was important was the way the risk was managed. So I think the important lesson that we could actually draw from the games that happened back in Tokyo is that it actually happened, and there are possibilities to minimize risk and address them in a right way, but also that making it possible for a safe and secure delivery of the games. The other point, probably that we have as a blue print referring to the games, is since the outbreak, the coronavirus crisis, the IOC has actively supported the athletes, the national Olympic committees, the international federations, and many others, the stakeholders and the partners, in a way that it was it has put forward an additional aid package program of about $100 million. But I'm going to come back on this topic probably when I address later on the specific, financial impacts that has the pandemic created on the games. But I'd like to focus, generally for this, for the games to happen. That was also another approach that the IOC used to support the network and the whole Olympic family. The other point probably here while we are on the blueprint is the Olympic movement faced, unprecedented challenge of organizing, the games. The postponement of the games itself was a big challenge. And the fact that it actually happened a year later was also another challenge in terms of planning and execution. So while also helping all these stakeholders, the crisis actually helped IOC to embrace and see the practicality of the stakeholders and the partners that were actually involved in the preparation of the games, starting from the organizers of the games. So for many NOCs and IAs, they were facing significant financial hardships from the crisis, where the IOC had, witnessed now through the experience. We can actually forecast and foresee what the future games is going to look like, and what kind of financial sustainability we as an IOC need to apply. And then going to my other point, for the IOC, sport is not an entertainment business. And I'm saying this very much because for me personally, I feel that the pandemic actually has witnessed this. It has witnessed that sports come with a value, and that value is actually what makes the Olympic movement a movement worldwide and globally that is looked after. So because it emphasizes the essential role of the sports in society. We've seen sport is widely recognized as an essential factor in fighting the pandemic, and as an integral part of the solution for the crisis and recovery. And how the IOC positioned itself is there were different activities that were continuously going on to share the values of sport and how it can effectively fight back the pandemic and put us all in sane conditions so that we move on with what we were living. So and we have seen in the last few months, in particular in the times of the lockdown, that social distancing and the uncertainty that was really within this pandemic was the greatest challenge. And that's why the IOC embraced the Stay Strong, Stay Active, and Stay Healthy campaign. It was very significant. It resonated so strongly with almost 500 million people being introduced in a single day, literally in the campaign, through the world's biggest digital Olympic workout platform. So that's the kind of creativity that was initiated, and also that's why we say for the IOC business, sports is not simply an entertainment business. And then this contribution of sport to the public health actually has been acknowledged among many others by the world, like the World Health Organization. That's why we actually, in the midst of the pandemic, the WHO signed a cooperation agreement with the IOC to promote a healthy society through sport. So, given all these values, that's why I'm trying to elaborate on the second emphasis when we speak about this pandemic and sport, that we say sport is not simply an entertainment business, but it's of value to the society, generally. And then the last point I'd like to make for this introductory part of my, my speech is, it's actually my favorite one, and it's like the change or be changed motto that the IOC president himself took personally in, and also infected the whole Olympic movement in terms of designing and coming by a roadmap called the Agenda 2020. In the introduction, Ivo mentioned that this agenda has been a personal initiative by the IOC president, but it was embraced by the whole IOC session and endorsed as a roadmap for the future. And focusing on the pandemic season, the other roadmap that actually came up last year was the Agenda 2020 +5. And this new roadmap is the successor to the Olympic Agenda 2020 and determines, the direction of the IOC and the Olympic movement in the coming couple of years, which is until 2025. So this roadmap addresses many fundamental questions, like what does the future hold for us for the Olympics? How can the Olympic Games stay relevant within the society and within the world? Why do we need to change? And why do we need, new norms? There are many things that we are now referring as new norms, and why do we need them? So all these questions have been significantly addressed by this roadmap, which was unanimously adopted by the IOC session and used as a flagship, roadmap and strategic plan to move on in the coming couple of years to face the challenge that we are facing now, but also to use the opportunities that we are now seeing due to the pandemic, because many of our lives have changed due to this pandemic, and so is the Olympic Games has also changed due to this pandemic. So I think it's now clear to all of us that every aspect of life will never be the same. I mean, personally, professionally, and worldwide. And this is very much true, and this applies to our sector, the world of. So that's why the IOC took a bold step to embrace the change or be changed drive to, come up with our roadmap of the Agenda 2020 plus 5, and also the future directions that we need to set for the games to happen. So saying all this, I think this is my 5 minutes is there, and I now hand over to you, Paul, for the next section.
Thank you, Dagmawit. There's some excellent content there and food for thought. And 3 words I've written down was stay strong, stay active, stay healthy. I think they're very, very strong words that I'm sure we might come back to. But I think we've got Andrew's sound working now in Switzerland. So good morning, Mr. Ryan, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. It's really nice to be able to speak to everybody today, even if it's not in person. Obviously, I'm going to speak from the point of view of the international sports federations, or at least the ones I represent, who are the 33 members of the Summer Olympic Games program for Tokyo. And I think it's first of all important to note how catastrophic for many of them the impact of COVID has been. And the easiest way to sort of quantify that is to imagine that in any 4-year Olympic cycle, between them, they sanction or organise more than, well over, in fact, 8,000 international events in that period. So in a 4-year period, they're well over 8,000 international events to find homes for, of very varying sizes and degrees. But perhaps the biggest impact of the COVID pandemic has been, I would say, the way it's acted as a catalyst for change, not only obviously for sport, but in society as a whole. And what we've noticed is that many of the trends which were already in place were accelerated by COVID. I mean, international federations have been, in many cases, quite slow to react, slow to change, and slow to adapt to the ever-changing world we live in. But perhaps one of the few positives coming from this last period has been that it's caused international federations to really accelerate the way they look at how they should be placed for the future. Obviously, the economic shock was great. The international federations, you could say, if we carry on from Dagmawit's opening comments, the average international federation depends approximately 35% for its revenue coming from the Olympic Games. But there's a big range within that, of course, ranging from 1 or 2 federations who are sort of in the 80% plus category, dependent on Olympic revenues, to those bigger ones who are well under 10%. But nevertheless, it's been a very big impact and a very big worry. So the IOC actually offered to provide interest-free loans, advances, which in effect have been against future Games revenue shares. and almost 50% of our members took some kind of loan. Those loans totaled around about $50 million, but these have been paid back because our big concern, of course, has clearly been how we would deliver the Tokyo Olympic Games, or even if we could. And by succeeding, in my experience, an extraordinary effort from all the stakeholders for once, really pushing to deliver one event, all with the same agenda and same goal, it was quite an achievement. But that is a great relief financially, because it means that the Olympic revenues are being paid to the federations, and it means that the loans that they took in almost all cases, I think, can be paid back. But I think if we look at what is then the real impact of this, and we've got other speakers on here, so like Paul, who I'm not going to therefore take his territory, but the first thing that happened was that federations looked for ways they could communicate better with their members, with their fans, and so on. So digital content creation was a really big game changer here. We're all aware about esports, and Paul will talk, I'm sure, much about that. But to be honest, for most international federations, other than perhaps FIFA, it's not yet a major part of their revenues. There are sports there who have developed incredibly their esports work, like sailing, for example, very successfully. But for most international federations, the big impact of the digital content creation stage was just the development of a digital strategy and finding out ways to use a web-based approach and a digital approach to engage with their communities. We definitely have seen a massive change in culture. IFs are much more innovative, and I think for host cities in the future, this will be a big advantage, because in the past, being a little bit controversial, I think my members were sort of approaching host cities always with the same model and saying, this is the model on which you have to deliver our event as a host. Now there's much more of a partnership in this. There's a much greater, let's say, willingness from the international federations to engage in a totally new and innovative approach each time they discuss with the host city and award an event. In addition to that, we've seen the need recognised by the international federations for a much bigger diversity of revenue generation. We're all aware, and we've got John who'll talk about rugby, that there are international federations with one huge event on which increasingly they are going to have to diversify a little way away from, because the Rugby World Cup was a fantastic event in Japan, and everybody's very pleased that it escaped the COVID period, but only just. And had the Rugby World Cup been cancelled, that would have had a big impact. So certainly federations like rugby, we're seeing it a little bit with FIFA, perhaps there's plenty of controversy in the news over changes that FIFA might make to its calendar. But really and truly, a lot of the federations realised they needed to diversify their revenue streams, because they had to make sure that they weren't just dependent on one or very few major events. If I go on and talk about how IFs reacted to the finance and administration, well, clearly there's a major change here, and they recognise the need for to have a reserve policy, to have strong reserves in place in case something like a pandemic hits in the future. Risk management is an area which is very important to them now, and something which very few of them would have looked at properly in the past. And I think it's worth noting at this point that some of the international federations already proportionately had very big reserves. And it's always a controversy here whether they should be spending all the money they've got on developing their sports and supporting development worldwide, or whether they should be guarding against the future. And certainly those federations, I won't give examples, that had substantial reserves were of course able to ride through this storm in a much better way than others. One or two who operated more in we could say, a corporate sense, with few reserves but a lot of investment all the time, struggled a bit, and it's getting that balance right that's very important for the federations. What we're seeing now, of course, and all of us as cities and events rights owners, is what I call the calendar crash and calendar crush as well. We're well aware last year of the fantastic cooperations that went on between, for example, the Commonwealth Games, World Athletics, FINA also, to find dates which meant that they could move to 2022. I sit, in fact, on the Coordination Commission for the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham next year, and the cooperation was very good. But the reality is now that, of course, there are a lot of events which have to be staged, some postponed ones with contractual commercial obligations with sponsors and broadcasts and so on, and there will, without a doubt, be a considerable fight over the calendar, because we still see initiatives from different stakeholders in sport to put new initiatives, new events on. And of course, there are only 52 weeks in any one year, so this will be a big battleground for sure in the future. In staging events, the international federations recognise now that the importance of medical protocols for hosts and international federations is a game changer here. This would have received relatively little the medical side attention in the past, just the provision of emergency services, access to hospitals close by, treatment and so on, and the basic protocols. That's completely changed, and it's clearly going to change for probably forever, but certainly the foreseeable future. The general conditions under which spectators, athletes and all participants in major events take part in those events is largely going to be influenced and governed in some cases by their work. So finally, team and individual competitions, of course, are much easier to award and much easier to host. World championships with perhaps 100 countries participating are much more complicated. But I'm going to leave it there with those thoughts. That's where the international federations sit, and I thank you very much, Paul. Over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. I think that's a really fascinating insight of the challenges that international federations have chased, and indeed the Olympic movement. We're going to head from the, I know where it's snowing in Switzerland today. It certainly was last week when I spoke to Andrew. Probably head from the snow of Switzerland to the warmth of California, and a very early good morning to Paul.
Thanks, Paul Bush, for having me, and hi to Dagmawit, Andrew, and John as well. It's great to be back at Host City from California. It's the middle of the night here, but I wouldn't miss Host City for anything. And I also want to congratulate Host City for bringing us together, and a big shout out to our community, who I know are watching from all over the world. I'll give you a bit of background and a bit of introduction on what we've been doing at the Global Esports Federation. I also want to acknowledge the tremendous effort that everyone has been leveraging to in fact move us forward. And I think it's great that Host City went straight to the middle of the discussion and talk about and let us all share about our experiences with how we're handling the pandemic and maybe the way forward as well. For the Global Esports Federation, it's a very exciting time, of course. We're 9 days out of our first ever Global Esports Games in Singapore, where we're headquartered. And curiously, on the December the 16th, 2019, just about 2 years ago, we launched the Global Esports Federation in Singapore. And on that very day, we had 940 million hits across our social media channels and platforms. And for me, who's someone who's spent some time in the Olympic movement from my home city in Sydney, working across many cities and countries around the world for about 20 years before moving in consulting, I really understood at that precise moment, the very next day when the data was shared with us, that the size and scale of the potential of esports. But I saw it through a lens of the way we connect as people. And then, of course, 3 months later, step by step, the world seemed to shut down, and we headed into pandemic in different stages of lockdown and different stage of hybrid operations for all of us in events around the world and for cities and countries around the world who tried to find their way through this. But one thing about gaming, which was particularly interesting to us, esports and gaming in particular, gaming obviously an incredibly large-scale activity with more than 3 billion people involved in gaming. The Global Esports Federation thought, what could we do to bring about credibility, legitimacy, and prestige for esports in this very rapidly changing world? And in fact, Andrew touched on it just before, where he talked about for some people in the world, it was thinking about their digital strategies, and we looked at it through a lens of how we can help and be in service to the esports community. And that then rapidly became also how we could support the sports community, because for all of us, of course, we are great lovers of sport and we enjoy esports and technology. And I'll speak a bit more later, Paul, about the metaverse as we move towards this incredible phenomenon known as the metaverse. And we thought we could do a lot collectively to help and support these right around the world think about digitalization, and particularly engagements with the fans and the communities and indeed the stakeholders. And we started with these 5 incredibly powerful values of our organization around equality, fair play, diversity, inclusion, and importantly for us as well, innovation. So in a little bit more than a few hours more than 9 days, we'll be coming to the world from Singapore at our Global Esports Games, where we've had more than 50 countries, 50 delegations participate in the preparation, and we think that we'll have at least 40 countries and territories in Singapore, maybe more than 100 athletes and gamers there. But we're expecting to reach many tens of millions of fans around the world across from the Global Esports Games and this December. And that's before we head to Istanbul in 2022 and in Riyadh 2023. And interestingly for everyone maybe to note, the rise of esports has also been the interest in cities to think about this in terms of transformational strategies, digital strategies of cities, and how cities look to hosting events. And it was interesting for all of us that when we did an outreach for cities to look to host our Global Esports Games, our flagship event, we had 9 applicant cities from incredible cities and countries right around the world. And on the 17th of December, our board will meet in Singapore, and hybrid actually right around the world for those that can't travel. And the board will select the cities to host the 24, 25, 26 and 27 Global Esports Games, which really gives us that runway that we often talk about at the GF, about thinking about how to create this sustainable ecosystem, not just for esports, but also for communities to engage with esports. I think one thing that's interesting to us is coming back to this notion of how we could be in service to the community. Community is something we talk a lot, and I know that both Dagmawit and Andrew also spoke about community, the way we engage with communities around the world. That's certainly something that's codified in our motto, World Connected, which is something we think sort of summarizes our joint ambition. But a lot of us really felt that we spent this last couple of years with our, in a sense, one foot on an accelerator, one foot on a brake, but hopefully both hands on the wheels as we tried to navigate through this kind of really unprecedented time. At the same time, we thought that we could do much more than stage incredibly prestigious events. And we also realized at the GF that we had this responsibility somehow. And some of the things that Dagmawit talked about as well in her introduction around the concerns for us around health and wellness, our connection with UNESCO in their incredible program called Fit for Life that encourages people to move is something that we brought to esports. Our connection with education, our connection with youth, as we start to think about the future of work and how people will work in the future and connect and contribute to economies and the development of cities, but also societal impacts and a lot of the social discussions that have occurred across the last couple of years, and bringing down these unacceptable barriers to inclusion and prosperity, not only for the most developed countries and cities in the world, but also those that are developing as well. So I think in summary, Paul, I would say that our suggestion is that we are living in a time of where it's not necessarily a binary decision about one thing or the other. We're thinking about how we can connect, how we can work together to utilize our joint knowledge, our joint capacity to do well for the world and make the world a better place. Thinking about how to stay healthy, staying optimistic and staying connected. And I think it's something that we've certainly learned that we can do better together. Thank you.
Paul, that's absolutely fascinating. I think that the statistic of 940 million hits is quite astonishing, to be honest. It's not something I've heard before, Paul. So it's great that you could share that with us. We're now going to go on to John Dutton. And John was one of the unfortunate ones that had to move a World Cup from 1 year to the next year. And I'm sure he's going to share some fascinating stories as to how that manifested itself. So good morning, Paul and John, and welcome.
Good morning, Paul. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for this opportunity. As a brief bit of background, the Rugby League World Cup 2021 is 3 tournaments, the men's, women's and wheelchair disciplines, all on the same platform, huge drive towards equality, particularly around participation fees and prize money. We have 61 games across 21 venues, 32 teams representing 21 nations. And as Paul said, after 6 years worth of hard work, we were due to deliver our tournament in October and November, but took the very difficult decision in August to postpone for another 12 months. I firmly believe that the world was changing quite rapidly before the pandemic, and to steal Andrew's words, the pandemic has accelerated change. Changing consumption habits, exponential growth of digital and gaming, ethical decision making, less cities bidding for major events, and a drive towards social benefit as well as economic benefit for major events. I think events with a purpose can be a shining beacon, a chance to bring people together, which is particularly special and resonates after the pandemic. We talk about 4 Ps: people, place, pride, and planet. And certainly events can be a celebration of civic pride on a local level, on a global scale, a celebration of humanity. I believe the pandemic has made us more compassionate, has made us think more, not necessarily taking the things for granted that we did before, going to live sport as one example. So our learnings from the pandemic and working through postponement, we have all tried to master the art of managing uncertainty, learning to be agile, learning to be nimble, having a plan, recasting the plan and going again. And certainly for my team, for myself, developing a high degree of resilience and I guess finding perspective within all of this. But I think events in the future and now can look to opportunities from the crisis, building relationships, using sport as a force for the good, demonstrable social impact, and certainly the ability to use sport to influence policymakers with soft power and diplomacy at the heart. Events with purpose, I think, are here to thrive, Paul, but maybe what happens off the field of play is as important now as what happens on the field. Back to you.
Interesting nuggets there that I'm going to sort of build on now, as we've got about 15 minutes. So I'm going to ask the panel to be quite succinct now, if they could be, in their responses to questions. I've got a whole raft of questions here. I'm going to start with Dagmawit, because I'm sure that one of the things that will fascinate the audience is Dagmawit, for those of you who don't know, also sits on the IOC Finance Commission. And when we chatted last week, she said she was very happy to share with us how the IOC have coped financially with the challenge of the pandemic and the postponement from one year to the other. Andrew's obviously talked about the International Federation perspective. I'm going to come back to John Dutton to talk about what they've done around Rugby League World Cup on finances in a minute. But Dagmawit, if you give us a very short, succinct view of how the IOC have coped financially in this challenging period.
Thank you, Paul. I'll be very brief, and I'd like to also make notes here for all our participants that what I'm going to actually share with you is a public knowledge, and many people can access the specific infos of the financial impacts that the IOC faced through the website of the IOC and in the published annual finance report or the IOC report that is published every year. So for detailed ideas of how specifically the IOC was impacted financially, we can all view there. But I'd like to quickly share with you that, just like the many other sectors, IOC, the consequence of the financial burden was huge, and that includes of course the National Olympic Committees, the athletes, and the international federations. So despite the financial impacts on the organizations, the first step that was taken by the IOC was to keep its initial commitment for the organizing committee with the overall contribution of the games, but also making into this position after the IOC Executive Board approved the additional or the general USD 1.7 billion that was required, for the for the added to address the COVID-19 crisis. So this envelope, which is around USD 800 million of the total amount, was the IOC's assessment of the impact on its part of the responsibilities for the organization of the Games Tokyo 2020. So its own extended operation and support for the wider Olympic Games, and the deep assessment actually gave its perspective of how big or small these figures should be in terms of the IOC's contribution. And this contribution comprised of two parts, and which is literally the major part, which is around $650 million, the cost for the organization of the postponed Olympic Games, that was going to be faced organizing committee. And another contribution of $150 million for the Olympic movement, in particular for the international federations, for the national Olympic committees, and for the recognized organizations to enable them to continue their sports and activities and their supports to their athletes. And this is not only for the Games time, but of course after the Games time as well. So through the solidarity as well, the Olympic solidarity, the IOC subsidies committed around $10 million for the NOCs, specifically to be spent for the Games. And another 15 million, supplementary budget, which is needed to extend the Olympic Solidarity Athletes Program, which covered around 1,800 athletes from around 185 national Olympic committees. So to sum up, for the IOC, the contribution and the additional cushion that was provided there was not the ultimate goal, but also through its flexibility and through its innovation, IOC, by working closely with the organizing committee, was able to make savings of around $280 million. And this was actually in addition to the 2.2 billion saved during the review of the venue. As you all know, the new approach and the new norm, even before the pandemic, was already alert and was already ready to change the approach that the Olympic Games has towards organizing the Games. So these were the major impacts of the finances, and I said you can all find it within the website for detail. Over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Dagmawit. Quickly over to you, John. The implications on your budget with a 12-month cancellation.
Yeah, pretty significant, Paul. We've discussed previously, I believe that events are quite inefficient. They're obviously very expensive, and adding another 12 months worth of delivery has created a challenge. We're in a very fortunate position. We have a significant amount of funding from UK government. We're delivering 86% of our tournaments in the north. It's set against a political agenda, levelling up. But certainly we've had to be quite creative. We've had to overperform on commercial. Our business model means we've got lots of cost and very little broadcast revenue. But again, I think it prompts a bigger conversation about the efficiency of delivering major sports events in the future.
Thanks. I've just been told in my ear that we've got about 5 minutes, panelists. So what I'm going to suggest is I'm going to give you all sort of a 1 minute sort of brief, just to give an opportunity to crystal ball gaze, really. And what do you think the landscape's going to be in 3 years' time in the major events industry? Will we be back to 2019? Will we be in a very different environment, or will we be in a high? Start with you, Mr. Ryan in Switzerland.
Thank you very much for putting me first, giving me thinking time, Paul. But I think when we look ahead, the way we see it from our perspective here is that it's not going back to normal. There are things which have changed, which will never be the same again. We know this from, the working environment too. But I think the big difference is that, as I say, the future of staging events for host cities and rights holders, rights owners, is much closer to a cooperation, and to make sure that the benefits from staging events are much more negotiated, optimised, and, as has been said already, paying much more attention to areas like sustainability and social contribution and development. So I think that this has been one of the few positives of the pandemic, has been it will change the way in which events are delivered, and I think it will be much more along those lines. The big problem for the future, 2-3 years ahead, is going to be about how the calendar is rationalised. We're seeing this crash and crush for all the players. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Paul?
Yeah, I think that what we have to acknowledge is that this is a transformational time, isn't it, in our lives, and really what we think is that this is thinking about, when we think about the future, thinking about the future not just of staging events, but actually the future of entertainment, when we combine sport, esports, music, and as well as that, what we say, how we live our lives, right? How we like to live our lives, how we like to spend our leisure time, and how we like to be entertained. So we see it as a very transformational time. It's transformational also because we're right on the edge of the fourth industrial revolution. So it brings into question how we relate and how we interact with technology. You know, whether or not we'll embrace technology, whether we'll lean in, whether we'll think about it, whether we'll seek to be educated on it, whether we'll do that, because we know that many young people, youth, roughly in our target demographic between something around 14 and 38, are really active in this space around technology and looking at the future of work. Not only when I went to school, of course, maybe thinking about a job for 10 or 15 years and a couple of careers. Now we know that most people are thinking about careers in fractions of that, maybe 2 years, and moving into completely different careers as we power up the creative economies and what we call the passion economy. So really it talks about our relationship, I think, with technology, how we see to embrace that, and how we see to use that not only to transform the ways we live as communities, but also the way we choose to live our lives as people.
Thanks. John?
Just to absolutely agree with what's been said already, I think the pandemic has changed our lives forever. There is no turning back. Events will need to continue to innovate. I think customer expectations are higher than ever before. We need to make sure we find a way of creating opportunities to build memories. And as Paula said, the metaverse, NFTs, that exponential growth in digital and the use of technology, that's here to stay. That's not going to go away. Thanks, Paul.
And I'm going to give the last word to Dagmawit.
Thank you, Paul. So I would say we need to collaborate. We need to have enough flexibility. We need to have the wisdom to embrace what is, in front of us. And above all, we are no different. Wherever we come from, wherever we are, and whatever we do in every and each sector, we are all implicated. So we need to cooperate. We need to be innovative. We need to have enough flexibility, and we need to lead by example. So we need to live the life in order to impact, what's holding for our future. So that's what I would like to say. Paul, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. I have to say, personally, I could spend probably all morning talking to these four because they're extremely passionate, but also extremely knowledgeable. Sadly, we have to finish. I was told to finish at 10:15. I think we just about finished on time. So well done to the four of you for keeping to time. Some really strong, powerful words in the end there, around transformational change. It's changed our lives forever. Cooperation, negotiation, optimization. Andrew's words around calendar, I think, ring true to all of us. But on behalf of everybody online, I would like to offer a very sincere thanks to Dagmawit, to Andrew, to Paul for getting up so early in the morning in California, and to John. Sincere thank you, and look forward to the rest of the next 2 days. Goodbye.